damage of radioactive pollution to agriculture. أضرار التلوث الإشعاعي على الزراعة. My name is student زينب سلمان and غفران محمد علي and تبارك رحمن محسن. Abstract extensive remediation was conducted on contaminated landscape after the cannabis extinct in 1896. A brief review of the main features of the contaminated landscape exposure, pathways and substance remediation is given. The current solution and lesson learned are also contrasted. Introduction. The information given here is large based on the EA Carnival Front report and edition relevant internals from the last descent up to 2060. The statement it possible release of reducers from Carnival nuclear power plant, which can be important contrast to internal and external dust arising from agricultural activity. Short-lived radioactive sports were particularly important in the emergency phase and contamination were put in place to reduce dust. However, exposure to radioactive in milk was significant, leading to serious cancer. 18 CR was large development within exclusion ZON. After the emergency phase, where most remained long-term dose from radiation. المقدمة تستند المعلومات الواردة هنا إلى حد كبير إلى تقرير منتدى تشيرنوبل التابع للوكالة الدولية للطاقة الذرية والأدبيات إلى أن جرعات خارجية الناتجة عن الأنشطة الزراعية كانت نظائر اليود المشعة قصيرة العمر ذات أهمية خاصة في مرحلة الطوارئ، وتم اتخاذ تدابير مضادة لتقليل الجرعات، ومع ذلك كان تعرض اليود المشع في الحليب كبير مما أدى إلى الإصابة بسرطانات الغدد الدرقية. Contamination and characterization of articular production land. The statement total deposition to laterals and freshwater escapement and orifice of wise, and the area of the basement was 56 km. Much of the contaminated flat landscapes around Carnaby was sparsely populated and concentrated agriculture, land with the small statement rivers and lakes, and forests. The areas that were most heavily contaminated by the Carnaby extinction were largely used for agriculture by cultivation firms and for forestry enterprises. Productive land, forests and lakes were used by local households to produce of harvest much of their own food. The most important articular products were milk, meat, grain, and potatoes. The Carnaby season occurred when the ground season had commenced and acclimatization animals were grazing or pasturing. Environmental pathways which products were contaminated. Both external and internal exposure pathways were important after the Carnaby extended. External pathways were relatively more important for forest workers, agricultural works, and people living in more highly contaminated areas. The importance of internal exposure pathways for agricultural forester produce, forestry production and wild food from forest was highly dependent on soil type and was often relatively higher compared with previous reported data. Thus, from terrestrial forests were generally more significant than from drinking water and aquatic food. The importance of soil characters in determining The especially vortices in the extent of radioactive transfer to food produced was indefinite after the internal period when interdiction limitation a common feature of many of the most contaminated areas where radioactive transfer to food was high presence of the salt tube with the less primitive of radioactive remained. Radioactive origin sensitive leading to high radioactive transfer for salt plant and thus animal. The importance of extensive system in contributed to internal that the human was indefectible radioactive transfers was particularly higher to measurements. Bears, some freshwater fish, wild game animals, and neither in both the UCR and former Soviet Union and parts of Europe. For commercial local husband acquired much of their data from extensive areas with low fertile soils leading to higher radioactive transfers. aka features of such soils was that radioactive transfer remained relatively higher for decades after the accident. Natural products such as measurements, bears, freshwater fish, and relative produced milk for some real people, substantial continental to the reputation thus reserved by humans, special to rural population with the forms solvent union will conspiration of such foodstuffs was unbenighted in some areas combinations was often poor.
My name is Gufran Muhammad Ali. Radiation measure adopted after the accident. The initial goal of recovery was the reduction of dust to humans. The temporary permissible level for effective annual dust reduced from 100 mcv in 1986 to 30 mcv in 1987. Annual dust reduced 25 mcv in 1988, 1989, and 1 mcv in 1991 and onwards. The long-term goal from 1991 onwards was an additional annual effective dust to the public of 1 mcv. It was also to enable residents of contaminated areas to return to a normal life. Temporary permissible level for radionuclides in food were established, which were gradually reduced with time. The radiation dust to members of the public to be used for remediation purpose cannot be easily measured, so operational easily measurable quantities were used, including ambient gamma dust rates H1 and deposited 137 per unit area. Plenary session PQM2 or per white PQ KG1DW soil restriction were introduced on food production and consumption, and extensive food monitoring was carried out after the Chernobyl accident. The contaminated areas were subdivided into different categories of remediation according to ground deposition ban shown in Table 1. The definition of contaminated land was set at 37 kpq M2, giving rise to an individual annual effective dose of 1 mcv. Table 1 designation of remediation activity according to 1037 grounds deposition After the Chernobyl accident, 1037 kbq m2 below 37 185 185 148 01480 designation of remediation activity not contaminated remediation for area with sensitive soil, wet peat or acidic sandy soil, remediation for sandy soil and light loam soils, full-scale remediation, not economic activity. Hundreds of thousands of people were living in this area, giving rise to individual and annual effective dose of 1 mcv. All settlements with an average annual effective dose of 1 mcv were remediated to allow production of food with contamination below the permissible levels and reduce their effective dose rate. This was closely linked with ensuring sustainable economic activity in the affected area.
My name is Dr.Teba. The current situation in the first 5 years after the Chernobyl accident, the goal of the remediation was thus education. Much of the focus of the mid-long-term remediation strategies of the reducing internal pathway. The approach taken in the 3 highly contaminated countries varied after the USSR split into separate countries at the end of 1991. The 3 countries of the former Soviet Union developed catalogs for each redeemed settlement containing the annual effective dose due to both external radiation and ingestion of the radioactive, strontium, and plutonium. The maximum effect from the countermeasure and remediation was achieved in 1986 for 1992. Since 1991, the preparation of animal products with the radioactive activity concentrations exceeding action level has been 1,000 of the gross output from the contaminated areas. Because of initial concentrations in the mid-1992, the use agricultural countermeasure were considerably reducing. Application rates were inadequate for both conventional food production and remediation, so some increases in 137 second transfer ushered. Nevertheless, remediation is still ongoing in some areas where there is still high radioactive transfer for the soil to vegetation, while cost-benefit analysis was a key factor during the first decade after the accident. The importance of considering social aspects increases thereafter. The long-term adherence to the banning, the collection and or consumption of the products has decreased. In response, there is a focus on providing readily understandable information and guidance on how people can reduce their personal radiological risk.